We're in what we call the lean-to, and some of the bigger pieces of the artifacts are stored in here because of the size and the space. This first buggy it will hold 2 people. It's 1 horse drawn, and you see in the Amish country a lot of these buggies being used today for their personal use. This was donated by a local man in Northampton, and you see underneath is the part that goes on the horse to pull it. With space, why we just took it off and put it underneath. Then on the wall are some ladders and ladder jacks. Most of the people don't use them anymore to paint with. They'll use something that will lift them in the air, and they can move it from place to place rather than having to move the jacks and the ladders. Then going on are some old fire extinguishers and a trunk that they stored their fire equipment in, their jackets and so forth. Then beyond that is a fire, well, don't know really what they call it, but they would pull it either by hand or with a horse to the fire, and the fire hoses were wrapped around it. It made it easier than lugging hoses from one place to the other. Usually it was connected to a tanker where they carried the water, because most farms in the country didn't have city water, so they had to have another wagon with a tank on it or a truck wagon to carry water to the fires. The school bus came from Mr. Belden, Chris Belden, that owned Belden Village, started Belden Village. They had a farm there, right near Belden Village, and his wife was at an antique sale. She saw that wagon and she wanted it. So it was stored in their barn for about 20 years. And one of the men that was on our Farm Bureau board was their caretaker as well as their farmer. And so he asked Mrs. Belden what she was going to do with the wagon. She said, well, I don't know. What should I do with it? Because they were thinking of selling the farm at that time. So he told her about the museum and that we'd like to have it. So she gave it to us. So that came from Mrs. Chris Belden. And it's quite unique because I had never seen one of them before. But Charles said when he went to school, they had one. And but most of the time it was pulled by horses. And so I think that's probably one of the first vehicles, or so to speak, that they took children back from home to school. And then on back further is the chassis from one of the first wagons that came to Talmadge. And it hauled this man. Well, he was a farmer and he was a minister and came to Talmadge in the early settling of Talmadge, and came from Connecticut. And I think originally it probably had a bed on it, and it was like a covered wagon, had the cloth top. He was quite a prominent person in Talmadge, and because he was one of the first settlers, I had someone tell me, well, those are not the original wheels. And I said, well, I'm sure they're not, because coming from Connecticut and farming, used it in farming for a number of years. He probably wore the wheels out or they broke or something. But the wheels that were put on it are wheels that were used in that day, but not on that chassis wagon part. We have 2 that came from the Summit County Historical Society, and the one what we called a horseless carriage, because it has a motor in the back, but it looks like it should be drawn by a horse, but it's not. Then the other one is a sort of a one-person buggy, like, that is used with the horses to draw it. Then further on back, there's an old wooden grain drill that came from Hudson and used on a small farm up there. Then across from that is the Black Maria that one of the sheriffs had built a number of years ago for the parades in Akron. Akron used to have a big parade, and so that was put in the parade. Well, he went out of office as sheriff, so he offered it to us, and so that's where that came from. Then the next thing I think in line is the Ritchie Turkey Farm feed wagon. And it was one of the first ones that was built. It has an auger in the inside. They would have a truck come in with the feed, fill that wagon, and then they would go from pen to pen. All of her turkeys that were raised to sell at Thanksgiving time were out in the fields, and they had wooden feeders out in the field for the turkeys. Then in the wintertime, they were in pens off the ground, and there was feeders on each side of there was a covered building and then a porch, a big porch onto that. And on the ends of the porch, they had wooden feeders, and they would take this wagon and go right up to those feeders and automatically put the feed into these feeders that are on the pens. So that saved them a lot of labor. And those turkeys were always used at Christmas time. And she had, the most she ever raised in one year was 10,000. And she home dressed all of the turkeys there. They had a big brick building, or a big mason building. And so most of the turkeys that were sold were dressed the day before they were to be sold. So they're all home fresh, dressed turkeys. And she had a great clientele. People came from Cleveland and all around. A lot of companies bought them as gifts. And they were all put in plastic bags and then put in a nice cardboard box. And so that the companies could hand them out for gifts at Thanksgiving or Christmas. Then there's a plow and a couple other smaller pieces of equipment that were used on the farm, and they're obsolete now. I mean, they have modernized them. And then let's see what's next on the line. There's cobbler shop material. There's an old cobbler's bench, there's sewing machine, a lot of wood frames that they used when they made shoes, and all sizes. What's next? I can't remember. The spinning wheel and the different things that they used to make clothing. They used a lot of the wool that they spun for hats, sweaters, lap robes, so forth. And then you come on down to, I think, all this electrical equipment that are different kinds of testing that they use to test all kinds of electric products, as well as high lines and so forth. This wagon back here that we just see the chassis, that was a Mr. Barnes. He was also a minister and had a farm. And I remember him very well. And remember going by his farm. It was what we called the Kent Road at that time, from the circle that went into Kent, and his farm was on the right-hand side. And I'm never involved in the buggies, but you see them in the Amish country now. They're still using them all the time. I'm old, but I'm not that old that I saw the school bus, because I lived within a block and a half of the school, so I walked to school. But at that time, they had the regular motorized school buses. And as far as some of the other things back here, some of my in-laws, Josiah, he was a shoemaker, a cobbler. So we have his cobbler bench that he brought here in 1803 when he settled the farm. And at that time, I think most of your generations back, they had a specialty besides farming, you know. One of them was a cheesemaker, had a cheese factory. And so besides doing the actual farming, they had a trade of some kind. We had spinning wheels there that I still have, so I'm sure that some generation used to, you know, have sheep and spun the wool to make garments and hats and so forth. But before I was married, there was a lot of this stuff that is here that I wasn't familiar with, because living in town, we didn't have it, and I didn't see too much, only locally, you know, because Talmadge had a lot of farms at one time. So, but I didn't. I lived on a city lot, so I wasn't used to some of this stuff. So it kind of boomeranged. I mean, people would see the museum and they'd say, oh, I have this, or I have that. Do you want it? And I said, sure, bring it. You know, there was a time when I didn't refuse anything. Now I'm getting a little choice because I'm running out of space. And if I have something, then I don't take the second one. But I had so much stuff given to me in the very beginning that it sort of filled up the first building, or the first part, and which we didn't think we'd ever have enough to put in it, you know. But, and people will say, you know, oh, this is in my barn, or this is in my attic, or my basement, or something. And I don't want, my children don't want it, and I don't want to throw it away. So we get it. And we have had stuff put in here on loan and then taken out. So that's why I say now I don't take anything on loan. It has to be permanent. Because once you get things hung up and labeled, it makes a hole to take it down and for them to have it back. And yet I can see where some of this stuff, they've become attached to it, you know. But if they just tell me in the beginning it's on loan, then, you know, that's different than thinking that it's yours and then have it taken away. So, but it's been exciting, and I've done a lot of research and a lot of looking for things to fill a gap, you know. So it's more of a display than just one or two things put somewhere. Well, the Farm Bureau had letters from Columbus stating that it's time some of the counties preserve some of this because all going to the dump, you know, and they think that it should be preserved. So I was on the board, Farm Bureau board at the time, and I asked them what they thought about building a building. Well, they thought it was a good idea, and of course when I suggested it, they said, well, see if we can get land on the fairgrounds. So at that time, my son was president. And so I asked Howard to bring it up at a board meeting, and they said sure, because they thought it would be an attraction and something good for the fairs, you know. So I went back to the board and told them that there'd be a place, and it would be high. I didn't want down low where we'd get runoff from those storms and things. We did once. And so anyway, took it back to the board, and they appointed me chairman, and Lisa's father, John, and then a man that lived down in Green, Mr. Hartong. So we researched different barn builders. And at the time, there was a real lull in building construction. So not Pulte, the company there in Worcester decided that they had 11 crews of Amish people that didn't have work at that time. So they really gave us a good price on building this building. And we told them that if we wanted it done for the fair, they had to get busy. Well, of course, they had the manpower. So they had that building, the first part, done a week before the fair. So we have a museum at home. And Charles said, well, we'll have to haul half of our stuff down to make a showing. Well, it didn't work out. That people just kept bringing stuff in the week before the fair. So we put up what we had and didn't have to bring anything down from home except what we wanted to give. And then it just kept boomeranging. People would see it. And like later on, you'll look at the drugstore. And there was a druggist in Talmadge that went out of business. And he sold it to one of his men that worked for him. And so then he passed, well, they sold it, and then he passed away. So his wife said, Jean, I have all this stuff stored in the basement. Would you like to start a drugstore? So we got some friends that were carpenters and went to Hudson. There was a drugstore right in Hudson that was, well, really like the old drugstores, you know. So I went up and I asked the son who was running at that time, I said, can I take some pictures of your area with soda fountain and so forth? And so he was glad to let me come in and take pictures. So we sort of more or less patterned that after the drugstore in Hudson, and which worked out real well. And then these two owners, the previous owners, Mrs. Holt gave us the soda fountain. She had it in her garage. And Mrs. Winkler gave me a lot of bottles and glasses and so forth. So between the two families, why we set up the drugstore. So it's just, I've been real lucky with people wanting, to get rid of their stuff and wanting it to go someplace to be preserved. And the two buggies, I was trying to think what Lisa asked you about. The two buggies, the big ones out there, one's a taxi cab and the other is a sort of a Sunday buggy, you might say. And they're on loan from the Summit County Historical Society. And I was told that the two big buggies came from the Firestone Estate. And they had them stored in a barn at the John Brown House. And when we went over and looked at them, I had another friend who had a garden center in Rootstown, and he had a truck with a bed that would come down and a wagon or a trailer that he could lower. So he took both of those over there, and we hauled all four of them with one trip. And it was kind of funny coming down the expressway. People would honk and they'd look like this. They'd never seen anybody hauling four buggies in one trip. But when we went to get them out of this barn, they were on the first floor. There was no flooring, it was just mud. And those big buggies were probably 6-8 inches in the mud, the tires. Now the one, not the taxi cab, but the second one, the Firestones had it done over so that they could use it in the Akron parade. Well, then of course they did away with that parade, and they just stored them there. So they're really on loan to us, but they're very happy. I had the president of the association here with 2 or 3 other men, and with Paula, who at that time was a curator, and they all decided that they should be left here because they didn't have room in this barn, and they have a second story in this barn. And we went up, and there's 2 more small buggies up there that I would love to have. But that second story is so full, they can't get them out. And they said that if they ever got anybody to help them clean out that, and everything in that second floor is all farm related. But so far, nobody's helped her out to move some of that out. And but the one is all rattan. It's a one-person buggy. It is really darling. When the farm was settled, Josiah made maple syrup because the 180 acres was all virgin timber, or all timber. He had to cut timber to build his first log house. And so then when we took over the farm, they were still making syrup, and they made all of it into candy. They sold candy to a couple stores in Akron and Kent. But then when we took over the farm, we enlarged the number of trees that we tapped, and we got up to 1,600 taps. And so we made a lot of syrup. And I think our biggest year was 400 gallons. And with the way the woods is and the clay ground, it took 50 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup. And at that time, we used wood to run the evaporator. And then we started milking more cows and got more involved in the syrup making. And so we went to oil. We had 2 oil burners, one in front of the evaporator and one in the back to warm the sap as it came in. So I did all the boiling, and it was a lot easier on me not to have to feed that thing with wood to keep it going. And I had a ruling, Charles laughs about it, if I would start the evaporator at 9 o'clock in the morning, why, when he got done with the chores, and another fellow would start to gather. Well, if I didn't have that all boiled in, by 11 o'clock, I shut down and went to bed. And but if he was done with all the chores and everything at 11 o'clock, then he would boil till we were finished, because we never like to keep sap overnight. It sours just like milk. So, and you have a much better grade of syrup if you boil it right away. Don't let it set afterwards. So I think the year that we made 400 gallons was, a couple of us worked overnight. He did. But we had a good market on weekends when the kids, we had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and when they were out of school on weekends, they would work the sugar bush with their dad. Then I would stay in the house and make candy, but I only made it on weekends on order. So maple sugar and maple cream. And But it was something that sort of filled in the gap, you know, between summer and winter in the spring before you could get on the fields. And so we quit making the year that he went to Columbus to work, because I said I wouldn't handle it by myself with kids. We had to have 2 Caterpillar tractors to pull the sap boats in the woods. And we had a man do it, but he moved to Ravenna, and then we depended on high school boys. And I said I wasn't in the sugar house boiling and have 2 kids running Caterpillar tractors in the woods, because if you slip a tractor, track, can't think what I'm talking about. If you slip a tractor, it takes a whole day to get that track back on the wheels. So I said, and the year before was a bad year, so I said, we're done with making maple syrup. But as I said, it was a good thing to fill in, you know, the seasons. So, but we brought a lot of the equipment down, and different kinds of equipment, and put it in there. So it gives them an idea if they are not used to going to a sugar bush, you know, in the spring, like Burton or someplace. Then it gives the children a little idea of. And then right next to that, we have another man in Stowe who was a beekeeper, so he brought some bee equipment down and put in there for me. So. But when they wanted to give it away, they bought it from somebody else. Up in the sugar country, I say, up at Burton, you know, in that area. But we tried to make a high-grade syrup, light, good maple flavor. If you get it boiled right away, you can make grade A syrup. And a lot of people do, but there's some that's pretty bad too. You know, it's real dark and strong. And when the buds start, you quit. And you can tell when the buds have started on the trees, because when you boil the sap, it smells like a rubber tire burning. So you know it's buddy. We call it buddy syrup. Mm-hmm. And you had to have freezing at night and thawing in the daytime to make it run. Now you could go a couple days, but then when it started running out of the trees, stopped running out of the trees, then you had to wait till it froze again. And in our woods, it had to get down to around 20 degrees at night and up to about 40 in the daytime. And then it really ran. And we used to have all the children from Stowe, Cuyahoga Falls, some from Kent, Hudson, because in their second grade reader, they had a whole chapter on making maple syrup. So the teachers would save that chapter till March, and they'd study that and read it, and then they'd make arrangements to come out to the house to see the process. And that time of year is really muddy, you know, with this freezing and thawing and so forth. So we'd always tell the teachers, have the kids wear boots, because they would have to walk, from here to the bathrooms, from where they could get off the school bus to the sugar house. Invariably, 9 times out of 10, all the children would have boots on, but the teachers would have high heels with toeless shoes on. So we had more than a few teachers that would say, well, I see what you mean about the mud. And then a lot of the teachers would buy a half gallon of syrup and little cups, and they'd give the kids a treat, you know, take it back to the school. And they thought that was pretty nice too. If it was just a little group, I'd have a sugar cake for them, you know. But sometimes they'd have 3 or 4 second or third graders, you know, come at once. But then we'd, if they wanted to go in the barn to see the cows and the milking setup, then we'd take them there too. So we educated a lot of children.